Welcome to Untold Lores, The Binding Ceremony, Part 3 of 4. The words hit Li Wei like a physical blow, and he stumbled backward, only to find himself pressed against the now solid wall. Mei Ling's declaration echoed in the pavilion with supernatural resonance, and he watched in horror as the faceless groom began to dissolve like morning mist, its form unraveling until nothing remained but empty bridegroom robes that collapsed to the floor. The ghostly guests began to applaud with the hollow sound of bones clicking together, their jade eyes never leaving his face. Li Wei tried to speak, to protest, to explain that he had never agreed to such a thing, but when he opened his mouth, no sound emerged. Mei Ling approached him slowly, her bone flower crown gleaming in the candlelight. "Do you remember that day by the pond?" she asked, her voice soft as silk and deadly as poison. "You were 8, I was 7. You said you would marry me when we grew up, that we would have the most beautiful wedding in the village." The memory came flooding back with terrifying clarity, 2 children playing by the water, innocent words spoken in jest, a promise made in the carefree way of youth. But children's games had become something far more sinister in death. "I waited for you, Li Wei," Mei Ling continued, circling him like a predator. "Even in the cold darkness of the pond, even as my lungs filled with water, I held onto your promise. And when death took me, I made my own promise, that someday you would honor your word." Li Wei found his voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "We were children, Mei Ling. It wasn't real. It was just make-believe." Her laugh was like the sound of drowning, bubbles rising from deep water. "Nothing is make-believe when you're dead, Li Wei. Death makes all promises real, all debts payable." She gestured to the ghostly guests, who began to move closer, forming a tight circle around them. "Everyone here understands. They all had unfinished business with the living world, but love is the strongest chain of all." The air in the pavilion began to shimmer with otherworldly energy, and Li Wei felt something invisible wrapping around his wrists like spiritual chains. Mei Ling raised her arms, and her voice took on the cadence of ancient ritual. "By the bonds of childhood promise, by the power of the restless dead, by the witness of those who have crossed over before us, I call upon the old laws that bind the living to the dead." The ghostly guests began to chant in response, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to come from beyond the grave. Li Wei struggled against the invisible bonds, but they only grew tighter with each movement. The red candles in the pavilion flared brighter, casting dancing shadows that looked like reaching hands across the walls. "I cannot marry a ghost," Li Wei gasped, his strength fading as the supernatural forces pressed down upon him. "Not for much longer," she whispered. She reached out and touched his chest, directly over his heart, and Li Wei felt a cold that went deeper than winter, deeper than ice, a cold that reached into his very soul. Where her finger touched him, he could feel his life force beginning to drain away, flowing into her like water into a thirsty earth. His vision began to blur at the edges, and he could hear his heartbeat slowing, growing fainter with each passing second. The ghostly guests watched with hungry eyes as his life ebbed away, and Li Wei realized they were all feeding on his death, drawing strength from his departure from the living world. As consciousness began to slip away from him, Li Wei heard Mei Ling's voice, as if from a great distance. "Don't fight it, my beloved. Soon we will be together forever, just as we promised. Death is only the beginning of our eternal wedding celebration." But just as the darkness was about to claim him completely, a new sound cut through the supernatural ceremony, the tolling of a distant temple bell, deep and resonant, and somehow wrong for the middle of the night. The ghostly guests suddenly looked confused, their chanting faltering as they turned toward the sound. Mei Ling's grip on his chest loosened slightly, and Li Wei felt a small spark of his life force returning. Through the haze of near death, he saw something that made his remaining strength surge with desperate hope. Standing in what had been the solid wall was his grandmother, not as a ghost, but as something else entirely, surrounded by golden light and carrying something in her hands that made all the supernatural entities in the pavilion recoil in fear. His grandmother spoke with the authority of heaven itself. "This wedding violates the natural order. Li Wei's time is not yet finished." But Mei Ling's response shook the very foundations of the pavilion. That's it for Part 3. Follow Untold Lores for Part 4. Like and subscribe for daily stories.